Welcome to the Agricultural Policy Podcast. I'm your host, Hansjürg Jäger, and today we have a fascinating topic lined up because we are going to discuss how agricultural policy in general is influencing our food production and the way we produce food in the US, but as well in Switzerland and in Europe. My guest today is Josh Baethge. Josh, hello and welcome.
Hey, Hansjürg, always good to be here. Looking forward to a really interesting conversation here. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about.
Yes, I think so too, and I'm very much looking forward to talk to you as well, because we are going to discuss how ag policy is shaping our agricultural and food world in general. And what we see now is, like in the US, we have a new Secretary for Health, I believe, who is said to be the fittest 70 years old around.
At least that's what he says.
So this is what he says. We don't know how
No, he's in
healthy he
good shape.
really is. We talk about Robert F. Kennedy
Yeah,
Jr.
he is.
Yes.
RFK Jr. for short. He's actually the nephew of former President John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1963. His brother, RFK Sr. was John F. Kennedy's brother. He was also assassinated in 1968, running for president. So, RFK Jr. comes from a very prominent Democrat family. Most of his personal career, he was an environmental lawyer, a big person in Democrat politics, even though he didn't hold an office. Just kind of Kennedy's hold a special place in Democratic policies. But in the 2000s, he kind of started changing some of his outlooks on things. He became a skeptic of vaccines. He started blaming chemicals for certain things, and he ended up running for president. We're kind of doing the fast version here, running for president last year in the race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And while Kennedy didn't ever get enough votes to challenge Biden for the Democratic nomination, so he decided to run as an independent. Wasn't doing great, but had enough support that when he finally dropped out of the race last year, he he still wanted to have a role in government. So he reached out to at the time, President Biden was still running and Donald Trump was running, and tried to, offered his endorsement to either one of them if they would give him something in return. And Donald Trump, said he would have a say in health policy. So Kennedy, a lifelong Democrat, ends up supporting Trump. Trump wins the election, and now Kennedy, RFK Jr., is in charge of the Department of Health and Human Services, which basically oversees multiple government agencies regarding health policy, things of that nature. And in the last week, towards the end of May, he released this report called the Make America Healthy Again report, or MAHA. It's a play on Donald Trump's slogan, Make America Great Again. And in it, he calls for a lot of reforms in terms of American diet. From an agricultural standpoint, the thing that's somewhat concerning is some of his language on pesticide regulations, on seed oils, things of that nature, which a lot of people who voted for Trump thought he would support less regulation, and indeed a lot of his officials do. But Kennedy's seemingly bringing a different point of view. So right now it's an open question which viewpoint is ultimately going to win out legislatively. His report didn't necessarily lay out any policy specifics, but more kind of a template to what he hopes to achieve. And the big question here now is this really going to have an influence on policy, or is this report going to go nowhere? So that's kind of where we are at this point in terms of RFK Jr. It's kind of just fascinating how different he is compared to a lot of people in the Trump administration.
But in the same time, he received a lot of criticism for his former life as a environmental lawyer. On one hand, his critics of vaccines or vaccination, has also sparked some criticism. So the question then is, how far do his personal beliefs also shape his policy decisions?
Yes, that's exactly the question, because a lot of the claims he makes aren't necessarily based on proven science, if you will. And just for example, like a report of this magnitude to come out only a few months into the presidency. Usually this is something, if you're going to make this kind of, if you're coming into office in February or late January, you're going to make this kind of assessment of U.S. health. You would usually need more time than a few months. So he's definitely received a lot of criticism in terms of what this report says, what it advocates, and it does line up with his personal beliefs. But yet, at the same time, there is some growing support, kind of on both sides from a certain segment of the population that do believe some of these things that maybe aren't scientifically based, but people believe anecdotally may have some truth to them. For example, he says processed foods are bad. I don't think that's a controversial opinion, but what his conclusions and what needs to be done, that's where a lot of the concern arises, especially from an agricultural standpoint.
Yeah, and I believe this is where agricultural sector is becoming very nervous and very well acutely aware, maybe also of the shortcomings. Because if we look from a Swiss or even European perspective to the US, what we often tend to focus on is like popular health, which isn't the best. The US has quite a reputation as being a bit overweight, having a lot of problems with diabetic diseases and other non-transmissible diseases, which then leads to the question: okay, what should policy do then to address these issues? In Switzerland, what we are discussing now is like doing the agricultural policy framework, making it bigger, to not only talk about an agricultural policy which only focuses on agriculture, but that includes as well health issues and the whole value chain, like from farm to fork. This is also what the European Union tries to do with the farm to fork strategy. So to really link those fields, agriculture and nutrition and sustainability and environmentalism and public health into one big policy, on one could say in one big beautiful bill, but this claim is taken for another project, I believe.
I've heard about that, yes.
So how is it on your side? Like, is there this idea as well to merge the different sector politics into one big policy project, or how would you see the evolution here?
There definitely is, and I think there's support. Like you just there's no denying. The Americans need to be healthier. I don't think there's any debate about that. And this "Make America Healthy Again" slogan has caught on at the Department of Agriculture. Some small steps they've taken are looking to take unhealthy foods out of lunches provided to school students. One thing, and nutrition assistance to families. There's new laws coming out to ban things like sodas and candies and ultra processed foods. And that's now there's some debate over, is that the right way to do it, since it's only affecting those in need. But so there are movements like that. I think where it gets controversial is when especially with agriculture, is when this plan that Kennedy has announced, starts affecting the way farmers grow their crops, affecting the type of products they can make. And then that's where, you get into the debate, like, is this more, is this a health-based change, or is this based on pseudoscience, fake science, if you will. And so that's kind of where agriculture right now is wary. So I think there is a general, philosophy of general need to be a healthier country. How we get there is what's controversial at the moment here.
It's quite similar here. I mean, we all agree, or almost everybody agrees on the line of healthy nutrition from sustainable origins. So this is where everybody says, yes, of course, we need to go into that direction. And then the question is how. And then you start having these deviations with different ideas and different beliefs how agricultural policy should be shaped. For instance, should it be more interventionistic or not? So the question, what role does government play there? I would assume RFK isn't advocating for a stronger role for the government in the food markets. Is this assumption correct?
Yes and no. I would say because he says, to make, to take a long report and try to simplify it. He says where he wants to get. We should eliminate these type of foods, certain types of farming practices. Doesn't spell out how to get there, so he doesn't have the authority to legislate within the system. Make recommendations. He can do certain things within his department. So. But obviously, I don't think he would come out strongly for regulating, because that's kind of the antithesis to what the Trump administration has been promoting: less regulation, let the market play out, let farmers do their thing without government interfering. But at the same time, he's trying to use the government to accomplish these healthier goals. So it's kind of hard to say, I guess.
So this means it's not clear which role the government will take in making America healthy again.
That's exactly right. It's like if I stood up here and talked for 10 minutes and said, here's what we need to do, and then I gave you no plan how to get there. I think that's kind of one way to look at this report. So, okay, great goals or not good goals, but what is he proposing to implement that? That's the trickier part.
For what reason?
I think that's a good question because when this report came out, we didn't know quite what to expect from it. We had an idea, but again, it's like you can look at this as one way. Like, is this a blueprint for what the government is going to do philosophically, or is this just Trump allowing RFK to get out his priorities and then it's not going to be his focus? Now, we know that, like I said, there are some things that the Department of Agriculture is doing, in terms of like policy for what type of products will be subsidized, to the public, those kind of things. But in terms of how it'll impact agriculture production, I think that's the big, and that's the concern that you've seen the organizations like the American Farm Bureau Association, which is a big farm advocacy group here, saying they're very concerned with the report. Now, Trump has also said he's going to take care of farmers. Secretary of Agriculture has said she plans to, quote, educate Kennedy. So it's up in the air. And I know it's a wishy-washy answer, but that's really the concern, is the unknown right now.
What we see here is like the role of the government can be interpreted differently. But if you're looking into the markets and into agriculture, and there is one issue that combines what we discussed right now with the MEHA and the discussion, well, what is like a good form of agriculture, is GMOs, the use of genetically modified organisms in agriculture. I would assume Kennedy isn't in favor of those GMO products based on the claim that he doesn't seem to be very keen to eat processed food.
And that's the interesting thing about the report, because he conspicuously did not touch on that specifically, because obviously from the U.S. agricultural standpoint, a lot of the ag lobbying groups are very much against any attempt to limit GMOs. So he actually didn't say, I don't believe he says GMO specifically in the report. So you can infer what he may think about them, but in his report he refers to chemicals and pesticides and other things, but he doesn't specifically say GMO. So that's an interesting part of this report as well.
And this means he isn't against GMO. I mean, we could interpret it that way.
At least not officially, and that's probably because I don't think there's any way the Trump administration would take a stand against that. That this is something that has become quite ingrained in U.S. agriculture. President Trump's one of his biggest bases of support is rural America, is American farmers. I think 70-80% of rural America supported him. And from that standpoint, I think if he was to go against them, it could very much hurt him politically, which is something he doesn't need at this point.
Yeah, and then there is GMO regulation in general. I mean, we have two principles which are in place, which is a precautionary principle used in the European Union and in Switzerland, which says, well, as long as you don't prove that it is safe, we assume it is unsafe. That's the precautionary principle. And in the US, you have the risk-based principle, which says, as long as you don't prove it's harmful, we assume it's safe. What you have in the US is the possibility to have huge lawsuits against companies, which we don't know, especially in Switzerland and the European Union. So this is like these two options of regulating GMO. And I mean, this explains very straightforward why in the US you have so much more GMO in place than in Europe, because in the US you assume it's safe as long as nobody proves the opposite. And here in Switzerland and the European Union, we are still fighting to get approval and all this scientific data to prove it's safe to put it out there. In Switzerland especially, we had this debate some 20 years. And now there are new options available. And then the question is, well, how do we regulate this GMO in the future? And this is an interesting feat, and I'd like to talk about this for the remaining part of this show, because it's such a big thing right now in Switzerland, in European Union, and in the US, anyways. So how is GMO regulation affected by MAHA for one side, and how do you cope with new technologies like CRISPR-Cas and other new possibilities?
I think you kind of stumbled upon something that is definitely, a cultural difference between the U.S. and Switzerland and the EU. Because American farmers, farm groups, all day they'll point to studies, from the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association. They have countless studies saying, "Hey, look, we studied this; it didn't cause any harm. We're good to go." And there's this belief that there's among a big segment of agriculture that there's not any more work to be done. That this is a question has been solved, and we're proceeding with GMO modified seeds, and as farmers have become used to using them, and it's easier to grow things, they get better yields, they reduce pest, all the benefits they see. This has kind of become ingrained in U.S. agriculture, so that any attempt to fight that is that there's a movement to make it perceived that this is just crazy environmentalists that are not using science. And I hear all the time, they're not using the science. That's one of the things with the trade negotiations right now. We want Europeans to use the science. Well, you go to the European side, it's like, well, here's the science. There's long-term effects that have not been measured yet. There's other concerns, and not to mention the benefits to companies that generate these and then are in control of a huge percentage of the seed supply. So it's definitely a different outlook between the two countries. And
Yeah, and it's interesting that on that basis, and knowing that Kennedy has been an health and ecological advocate in that sense, also he said that he's able to take on big companies. It's a very interesting realization, well, that he isn't against GMO officially.
at least not in this position here, and I think you're talking about politics, and he's not necessarily able to fully go into if he is in fact against those. I'm trying to look up some of his past remarks. I feel like he has comments out there, but he has to work within the constraints of the administration. The administration is not going to go against the big companies that make a lot of these genetically modified seeds, against the farmers that use them. That's pretty risky for Trump, and I'm sure Kennedy's not allowed to do that. At least that's my assumption. But I'm curious, from the Swiss perspective, from the EU perspective, how do they see this U.S. policy, this stubbornness to even consider some of these things, which, and not just Europe, it's the same way, and we have similar dispute with Mexico over GMO corn and coming from the U.S. So it seems like in many ways the U.S. seems very confident in its
Yes.
position, but nations around the world, don't see it the
No.
same way, and I'm curious how the U.S. is perceived.
Well, there
Where
are
you are.
two things. I mean, it always is a big discussion if there are free trade agreements around the corner. Like if there's something coming up. For now, there is nothing planned, nothing very concrete or clear. However, if it comes to this discussion, what always is seen is, for instance, the use of clarified water to rinse chicken. The use of GMO and other practices are also seen critically here in the European Union and in Switzerland. If it comes to GMO, what we see is that there is this very strong protection of the environment and this position on, well, saying that long-term effects aren't yet measured good enough. What we also see is if you're talking about new technologies like CRISPR-Cas, we see that the European court has ruled that also the new technologies are considered genetically modified or GMO. So this means, in a way, it has to be regulated in the same way. Yet the new technologies, they aren't traceable, so you can't say whether you had this variety with natural breeding or with the help of a gene scissor. And this brings some problems with regulation, right? And the way the European Union regulates it now is saying, well, it's both GMO, full stop. In Switzerland, we have now the draft on the table for a law that is specifically designed for this new type of GMO. In the same time, we do know a moratorium for the use of genetically modified organisms, which is prohibited for commercial purposes, but you can use it for research. So there are some, I believe, 2 or 3 research sites in Switzerland where GMO crops are tested and researched on, but there is no commercial use. So we are a GMO-free country. And now there is this new technology. Of course, the ecological groups say, well, the new technology is as well seen as genetics, like GMO has to be regulated in the same way. So meaning you can only use it for research purposes. And then there are others saying, well, it's not exactly the same as GMO because it could be produced randomly by nature. So you have to regulate it different. And now this is the question. We have now a law on the table, and lobby groups already say, well, it's fulfilling the wishes of the big companies on one side. On the other side, it said, well, it's a good compromise on regulating these new products. What we see here in general is that it's very difficult to really regulate these products properly. And it's interesting to see because in the long run we don't have much other options than doing it in the same way as the EU does it, because just of the size of the market and the dependencies we have with food import and exports. So it then comes to an end, which is like, well, it's the regulation in the US, and it's the regulation we have in Europe and in Switzerland. And then if you do trade deals, you would assume, well, in the effect, they are equivalent. So we say, well, there is a mutual recognition agreement, and you say, well, in the result is they're both safe. They can be used or not. It's up to the market to decide whether or not you introduce those products to the respective market. So this is one way how to solve then the problem. But of course, you still have this criticism of chlorine rinsed chicken, for instance, or the use of GMO or other products as well.
Yeah. I think ultimately that may be, where this goes, because it's the public perception of this. I think, in the U.S. you have you do have a growing market for people that want non-GMO products, and you see, and while I wouldn't say it's a majority, kind of, along with the farm to table movement, this kind of a movement to more naturally, locally sourced ingredients, you have more people wanting things that are grown organically without genetic modifications. But then you kind of, like you said, get into the issue of, well, what constitutes GMO? Where do we draw the line? Is cross pollination of 2 seeds naturally occurring? Is that okay? What about introducing other things into it? When you really dive down into what is considered GMOs that we don't want, I think that's a very painstakingly detailed discussion. And I'd venture to say a lot of people that have an opinion one way or the other have not thought about it that deeply to see where they would draw the line on that. So I think it'll be interesting to see where the market ends up on that. Might drive a lot of this.
Yeah, and then if you market something as being non-GMO, what we see then, well, what does it mean if there is the international supply chain, for instance, for soybean? You assume already a certain contamination with genetically modified crops, right?
Right.
So it tends to become harder and harder to really produce GMO-free products.
Absolutely, yeah, because the supply chain is so interconnected at this point. It's and like you said, it's hard to say because there's just so many steps that go into it on a global scale of agricultural trade these days.
Yeah, and then I mean, how does the you said the market for non-GMO products is growing in the US as well, but how is this monitored? I mean, how do producers guarantee that this is GMO free?
That's probably a topic for a whole other podcast. I mean, because yeah, that is a debate. What has to be done to make this claim. What's the enforcement? How is this certified? And there's still a lot of back and forth. I couldn't tell you specifically what it is at this moment, but I know there's lots of back and forth. There's state regulations, there's federal regulations, and it's kind of an open question, and you hear debated a lot. But saying that there is a desire of people to have non-GMO food, but they're sold as a premium product. I can go to the grocery store and I can buy avocados, and I can buy non-GMO avocados, and I pay a couple dollars more to have this certification on it. What does it mean? I don't know, to be honest, but people will pay that premium and think I'm being healthier, I'm helping the environment, but how much does it help? That's kind of a question a lot of us want an answer to.
And then there is going back to the starting point, which is like, how does ag policy shape our agricultural and food world, or like how is it linked together? We can draw the conclusion and say, well, it's linked in a way that the policy framework protects existing systems like supply chains, production systems. It fosters certain innovation, mostly linear innovation, so the improvement of the system. But it's not necessarily a good thing to really develop disruptive innovations. So there, the ag policy framework isn't that good, I would say. What do you think?
I think you kind of nailed it there. The U.S. agriculture system is based on abundant supply, availability all over the place, and but farmers are working with tight margins. So things like GMOs, they offer faster, more efficient ways to get bigger crops in a timely manner and fulfill all those needs. And I think that's why they've been embraced so much in the U.S. because the way the whole system is set up today, this allows them to do it in a cost-effective way. Where without it, there's a concern that costs will go up. Shortages could arise, availability, those type of things. And for a lot of people, that the benefits of it outweigh any, potential health concerns that may or may not exist, which kind of goes back to the original point of the difference of the European philosophy versus, the American philosophy is like, based on all that, it's like, there's a large push, not among everybody, but a huge part, and particularly within agriculture, like, until you tell us this is bad, we don't see any downside, and it has a lot of upside. So that
Yeah.
kind of sums it up a little bit.
Yeah, it's like almost always in the end, if you judge political measures, it's like this cost-benefit analysis where you put all on the balance, and then you see, okay, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages or not, and then if it's a like positive outcome, you can say, well, there are some downsides, but in general, we go with the upside. This is what we have here, and now this balance seems to be not the same in Switzerland and the European Union and in the US, which is interesting. However, looking at our time already, we're already at the end of this episode, and we see that the ways to regulate the agricultural sector do quite differ. So, Josh, thank you very much for this discussion. Any last words about the topic?
I think it's an issue that's not going away anytime soon, and I wouldn't be surprised to see us talking about this again at some point. But yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion, and I think we covered a lot of points, and I'm sure we'll have more to talk about in the future.
Yeah, thanks anyways for sharing your expertise and your point of view from the US. We're going to talk in the next episode about the question, what support do farmers get? We're talking about the cost of food, direct payments systems, SNAP programs, insurance policies, and I hope to better explain the differences and the similarities between the USA, Switzerland, and Europe. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast for more discussions on agricultural policy and trade. Feel free to leave your comments and questions. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and engaged with agricultural policy.